live. Got a couple minutes here. I'm going to be doing a question and answer session on SARS-CoV-2 pandemic and the political responses to it. We'll start punctually at 8 o'clock. If you're with me, go ahead and leave me a comment. Just say hi in the comments. Let me know if you can hear me. If you can hear me and see me right now, go ahead and just type yes into the comments for me, please. Can anyone hear me? If you can hear me, go ahead and type into the comments. Just say yes. Great. Thank you, Susan. Hi, Rita. Thank you. I assume you can hear me too. Benjamin from Ontario. Great. Thanks. Thank you, Meredith. Stu, excellent. Thanks for letting me know you can hear me. Just waiting. It's almost 8. We're going to start at 8. Excellent. Great. Thank you for letting me know. Let me know where you're from. I got Benjamin, let me know. He's from Ontario. I'm in Michigan. Hey, Mel, how you doing? I'm in Michigan. Let me know where you're coming from. So go ahead and type in the comments there. Just let me know where you're from. All right, it's 8 o'clock. We're going to be punctual here. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Hillsdale, New York. Okay, thanks, Stu. So to introduce the discussion tonight, this evening, it's 8 o'clock p.m. here, where I'm at in Michigan, Eastern Time. Just to introduce myself, in case you aren't familiar with who I am, I assume most of you are coming from my newsletter. You're already subscribers. You already know my work. But if you just happen to be jumping into this conversation, let me just introduce myself. I'm Jeremy Hammond. I'm an independent journalist and researcher, political analyst, and I have been researching for many years on a variety of different issues, from foreign policy, economics, particularly the role of the Federal Reserve, and foreign policy, particularly the role of the U.S. role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And in more recent years, I've been very active in the health freedom movement, speaking out against public vaccine policy. Since early this year, I've been focused pretty much entirely on the coronavirus, the 2019 novel coronavirus pandemic. So the severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, or SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes coronavirus disease 2019, or COVID-19. Has been the main focus of my research and my writings for most of this year. So the topic we're going to be discussing tonight is the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic and extreme political responses. So what I want to do is to kind of define the goal of this discussion, of the question and answer session that we're going to be having. So we have a kind of a clear, defined goal, and to be able to do that, I just want to provide a little context about what my view is. And so my view is this, is that in response to the pandemic, governments have implemented extreme measures, mostly through executive orders. These include stay-at-home orders, closing businesses deemed to be, by bureaucrats, to be non-essential, and otherwise strictly limiting business activities, and also universal mask-wearing orders, which have become very controversial. These lockdown measures have caused massive harm. I think this is uncontroversial. Massive unemployment being one obvious example of the harm. Also inflicting hardships on businesses that risk bankruptcy, so that people won't have jobs to return to. And the economic costs must be measured not just in terms of dollars, but also health and lives. There's a cost in health and lives that must also be considered, which haven't been considered by policymakers. My view is that these orders violate fundamental human rights, including the right to freedom of movement, right to contract, right to earn a living and provide for oneself and one's family, and the right to act responsibly based on unique individual circumstances and personal risk-benefit analysis. Another major risk that looms on the horizon is mandatory COVID-19 vaccination. So mass vaccination, from the very beginning of this, the end game, the openly stated end game of these extreme lockdown measures has been mass vaccination. And of course, many are advocating that once any vaccine gets to market, if and when that happens, that it should become mandatory. So politicians are dictating to us how we must behave on the false assumption that they know better than we do what's in our own best interest. And the media are serving their usual function of manufacturing consent for dangerous government policies that are not evidence-based. And they're doing public policy advocacy instead of journalism. And this is causing mass fear and panic, which of course is necessary for consent to be manufactured for these extreme policies. And so I feel what we can do is to speak out and to share knowledge, to educate ourselves and then educate others, to combat the mass fear and panic, and to respectfully and effectively challenge the views of lockdown advocates. So my goal is this for this question and answer session. So if you share my view, I want to give you what you need to know to effectively fight the threats to our health and freedom. But if you're here and you disagree with what I've just said and you have a totally different view, you're welcome to also challenge my view with your questions. So let me just give a couple of quick guidelines before we jump into the questions and answers. Let me just also give another quick shout out to my audience here. Go ahead. So I want to make sure that everyone can hear me and see me. So go ahead and just type yes into the comments right now if you can. Actually, somehow I've already done that. So go ahead and just type. Well, I guess go ahead and type yes if you can hear me. I can't ask people to say no if they can't hear me. I just want to make sure that I'm coming through loud and clear. If you can see and hear me, go ahead and type yes in the comments for me, please. And then I'll proceed. Great. All right, I got it. All right, a couple yeses there. Good. All right, so just some guidelines. So first of all, we'll probably take this about an hour. I don't really have a plan in terms of a cutoff, but I just figure we'll aim for about an hour here. This is the first time I've ever done a Facebook Live, and I'm alone. I don't have a helper, so I don't have somebody like reading questions for me and feeding me questions. So I have to kind of answer questions and also monitor comments at the same time. So you're welcome to comment at any time, of course, but please try to hold your questions until I invite them between answers. That way I can kind of focus on my answers when I'm speaking and then invite questions in between. And I'll do my best to answer as many questions as I can. However, if I don't get to yours at first, feel free to repeat it. I expect a respectful conversation. And if you're enjoying the discussion, be sure to hit the like button for me. And with that, I'll go ahead and invite questions. So feel free to just type your questions into the comments. Go ahead. Hit me with your questions. It can be about the virus or about the political responses. Thank you, Bridget. No questions yet. Go ahead and hit me with some questions. Anything you want to talk about. Some of the writings that I've done have focused on, for example, transmission. Of course, the mask issue, the lockdown, the stay-at-home orders, the effect on the economy, the issue of mandatory vaccination, immunity. Any of these broad range of questions. Any questions you have, go ahead and type them into the comments box for me. All right, Bridget's got a question here. Do you know if executive orders are enforceable in a court of law? Well, that's a really good question. I've been focusing, in terms of that. I've been looking at the situation here in Michigan. And so here, Governor Gretchen Whitmer, has issued executive orders, just like an endless stream of executive orders. And then she continually renews her emergency powers. So she's declared a state of emergency here in Michigan. And she has been challenged in the courts. and my understand last I knew that she was challenged. The courts did kind of uphold that some of her authority that she claimed that she does not have, but then she appealed, and so she can kind of continue doing what she's doing until the appeals have been heard. And also she's claiming a number of different laws in Michigan that she's kind of relying on for her state of emergency. So differs by state. My view is that all of these executive orders are unlawful. They're all unconstitutional, patently so. But of course, you have the courts. You have the Supreme Court, for example, will uphold completely unconstitutional laws. And a good example of that is when the Supreme Court upheld, the forced sterilization of women, which, by the way, they cited the logic of the Supreme Court ruling that upheld mandatory vaccination during the smallpox era, and that was the reasoning behind. And they said that authority, the authority to inject, to compel citizens to get a vaccine, it also extended to forced sterilization. So this is my view. It doesn't really matter what the courts say, as far as I'm concerned. It's patently unconstitutional, in my opinion. But of course, courts have different views. But it is good to know that at least in my state, hopefully in other states as well, that there are people fighting this. This includes business groups I know have sued the governor, as well as the Republicans have sued her. So, all right, Bernadette asks a great question about asymptomatic transmission. So what is the latest information about this? This is a really good question because it's very timely, because just in the past week or 2 weeks maybe, there has been kind of this, actually it's probably about 2 weeks ago now, there's been kind of a scandal in the media related to the World Health Organization, the WHO, where one of the scientists on the coronavirus response team for the WHO stated in a press briefing that asymptomatic transmission appears to be very rare, quote unquote, very rare. And this caused a big media storm in criticism of the WHO for saying this. How can she say it's rare, and we know that there's all these silent spreaders, this asymptomatic people who are out there spreading the virus around in the community. The first point to be made about that is that she was talking about truly asymptomatic people. So epidemiologists, they distinguish between asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic transmission. So this is one thing that was lost in translation. And she was very clear in her answer, actually, that she was talking about truly, quote unquote, truly asymptomatic people, meaning people who never develop any symptoms. And so those people who never develop any symptoms, it seems very rare that they would transmit the virus, based on the information and the data that's available. And she was also including studies that are not even published yet, that the WHO had access to that we don't. And so it was nothing untruthful about what she said, but of course she was attacked viciously by the media for saying that, because it's we're supposed to believe that there's all these asymptomatic carriers. However, then there's the criticism. Oh well, what's the difference between asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic in terms of the practical? What's the practical difference? They both mean people without symptoms, right? But there is a reason that they distinguish between asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic transmission, and a good example of this is of why it's practical is children. Consider children in schools, and we have all these schools closed right now, and if asymptomatic people are very unlikely to spread the virus, and children are largely asymptomatic. I mean, they're more likely to be asymptomatic than adults. Well, there's a practical reason why this is a relevant point to be made, that asymptomatic transmission is very rare. So then we get into pre-symptomatic transmission, and even the evidence for this, so that we're supposed to believe again that even if not asymptomatic, there's a lot of pre-symptomatic people out there, people who haven't yet developed symptoms, and yet they're spreading the virus around. This is the media's portrayal, is that there's all these people who don't have symptoms who are transmitting the virus through the airborne route, which we can also talk about. But to stay on this question of asymptomatic transmission, so there are studies indicating pre-symptomatic transmission. However, a lot of them, for example, are case studies, so it's very hard to know that they have what's called recollection bias, where people, aren't really quite sure. They're being asked and retrospectively, like, well, when did you develop symptoms? And so they kind of have to remember, and so people tend, the bias in that case is they tend to not remember earlier milder symptoms, and so they just remember, when they had like a very high fever, or they started coughing and sneezing terribly or something. And they don't remember the earlier milder symptoms. And the WHO official made the point that a lot of times they investigate these cases, and it turns out people actually did have symptoms. So that's one thing. And so the point, I guess the main point that I want to make in answer to this question is that scientists are really unsure, all right, about both asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic transmission. It does, there are cases where it does appear to have happened, but they really don't know the extent to which pre-symptomatic transmission is occurring, and to the extent that that's contributing to community spread. But there is agreement that symptomatic people are more likely to spread the virus. So Jennifer asked a question: do you believe that we're being lied to about the number of cases of the virus and the number of deaths? I think we're being misled. And there's a couple of reasons for that. On one hand, and this goes also to the point of the mortality rate or the infection fatality rate, because what the media like to report is what's called the case fatality rate, or the CFR, where they just take the number of cases that have been reported, or I'm sorry, the number of deaths that have been reported, and then divide that by the number of cases that have been reported, and oh, look at that huge percentage of people who have died. But this is an inherently overestimated mortality rate, fatality rate, because we don't know the number in the denominator, the number of infections that have occurred that weren't reported. And it's always inherently overestimated, because even if deaths in the numerator are underreported, the proportion of deaths that would be underreported is always going to be smaller than the proportion in the denominator who are underreported, because obviously, for the reason that deaths are obvious, people die, people tend not to miss deaths, whereas it's very easy to miss asymptomatic cases or very mild cases. People don't go to the hospital. They don't. Maybe a lot of people don't even know that they're infected, and so they're not reported. And so that's always inherently overestimated. So scientists distinguish between the CFR and what's called the IFR, the infection fatality rate, where they try to estimate the true number of infections in the denominator. So we've been lied to about the mortality rate in terms of, the media, government officials like to present the case fatality rate as though that's the number of people dying, the proportion of people who are dying, who are becoming infected, and they don't explain the difference between the CFR and the IFR. So that's one important point. But then, there's also the possibility that deaths in the numerator are being overestimated. There's biases both ways. I mean, they can be underestimated. There are probably some people who die and they're actually not detected, or they're not considered a COVID-19 death. That's certainly possible and probable, in my opinion. But at the same time, there are other biases in the numerator. So, for example, the CDC, unlike with influenza and unlike the WHO's suggested guidelines, has decided to use a single code for both confirmed and probable COVID-19 deaths. Meaning, so and a COVID-19 death is just defined as, they were tested, they had received a positive lab confirmation, they had a positive result from their test that they're infected with the virus, and then they died. So, which is another reason why there's another bias in the numerator, which could overestimate, because there's a distinction between deaths with the virus, with SARS-CoV-2, and from SARS-CoV-2. So just because they died with an infection doesn't necessarily mean that the virus is what killed them. So all kinds of these different biases that can affect the numerator. So whether the numerator is generally over or underestimated, there's no way for me to be able to determine. I don't know one way or the other. But we're definitely being lied to in terms of the denominator, because the number of infections is much, much greater than the number of reported cases. And another really important point to make about that is that even these studies that have been done that talk about, that they do, they're serological studies. So when I'm talking about positive cases, usually I'm talking about what's known as reverse transcription polymerase chain reaction, or RT-PCR assays, which you just detect viral RNA. So and that's another point. Just because somebody has viral RNA in their system doesn't necessarily mean that they have an active infection. It's not necessarily infectious virus that they're detecting. And another type of test is a serological test. So they test for antibodies in the blood. And so some scientists have used serological testing to try to estimate the denominator, the number of infections in the denominator for the fatality rate. And the thing to keep in mind about that is of course, those studies have shown that the fatality rate is much, much, much lower. The WHO initially said a 3.4% fatality rate. Anthony Fauci said 1%. He told Congress that this is 10 times deadlier than flu at 1%. And of course, the serological studies that have been done, it put the fatality rate much, much lower, between the range of like 0.2, 0.4, somewhere in there. But even those studies probably overestimate for one simple reason, which is that just because you don't have antibodies doesn't mean you didn't have an infection. And so studies have been done finding that antibodies wane pretty rapidly, which doesn't necessarily mean that, in the media, of course, report that as, oh, the immunity to coronavirus is very short lasting, it's very weak and short lived. And so, everyone's going to get reinfected over and over again. This is not what the science is showing us. The science is showing us that there's another immune response. So there's the antibody, the humoral immunity, but there's also cell-mediated immunity, and specifically T cells have been identified with SARS-CoV-2 as being very, very important for immunity. And so people who have not even been infected, people who have had no exposure to SARS-CoV-2, they found have T cell immunity to some level against this virus. And so there's the hypothesis is that when you get a common cold, from common human coronaviruses are a common cause of common colds. And so just getting a cold from one of the common coronaviruses, the immunity you gain from that also kind of gives you some cross-protective immunity against SARS-CoV-2. And so the point being, again, just to come back to the question, so even studies estimating the fatality rate based on serological studies probably overestimate the fatality rate, because a lot of people probably have had the infection, but they just don't have detectable levels of antibodies. So and all of those points, I think we're being lied to, because that's just not being communicated. So here I'm gonna try to catch up on the questions. There's been quite a few in the comments section here. I'm just gonna kind of read through. I don't want to maybe try to look for questions that several people have asked. So give me a moment while I read through them. All right, Donna's asking this question: what do you think the end game is? I'm assuming she means of the lockdowns. And the end game of the lockdowns, as I mentioned earlier, the start is mass vaccination. They've been pretty clear about that from the beginning. And as an example, I can turn to the Imperial College of London projection in March. I think it was March 12th that they had the paper that they put out projecting that in the UK, if the government didn't implement this extreme lockdown, that there was just going to be massive hospitalizations that would overwhelm the system and result in massive fatalities. And in that paper advocating lockdown, they stated very clearly that the lockdown measures would have to remain in place until a vaccine was developed. They stated it very clearly that was the end goal of the lockdowns, that we need to keep the economy, and they understood that it was unsustainable just to keep the economy in total lockdown like indefinitely. And so they proposed kind of like allowing people to have more freedoms, and then when cases start rising again, shutting down the economy again, and just kind of on off. And they had a graph showing that. Totally insane. Like, you can't just turn the economy on and off like that, and not expect massive result. And they acknowledged also right in that paper that they didn't consider the costs of the policies that they were advocating. How can you advocate a policy and not consider the costs and not consider the economic harms and the health and the cost and health and lives of those policies? And so they're pretty clear that they're advocating, the end game of mass vaccination. Incidentally, after the Imperial College was so instrumental in causing the UK to reverse its policy, and then also in the US and other governments around the world, the Imperial College got taxpayer money from the UK government to develop a coronavirus vaccine. So they're working on that now. So a little bit of a conflict of interest. So that's the end game in terms of what the lockdown is, and of course they have no other exit strategy, and this is the problem. They have no plan, like how are they going to end the lockdown? And that's the other point to be made about the Imperial College estimate, was that their own projections showed that once the lockdown measures were ended, that the epidemic wave, and the hospital overwhelm would be even worse than if the UK had just kept on with its original policy in the first place. That's their own projection. So, I mean, this is something that they know that this is going to happen. That if they ease these lockdown measures, that the cases are going to increase, and they're likely going to be kind of a second wave. And so they have no exit strategy from that. I mean, they don't really have any plan to be able to prevent that from happening. And here in Michigan, this is another important point. I don't know about other states, but here in Michigan, this is another thing to consider. Is that they sold the lockdown measures to us, to the public, not to me because I never bought into it, but to people who have consented to it. It was sold to the public on the grounds that we had to temporarily implement these measures to prevent hospitals from being overwhelmed. That was it. That's what the public was told. But of course, they've raised the bar. They've changed that so that now here in Michigan, the governor has declared a policy of continuing measures to one extent or another until the virus is essentially eradicated, until, as she says, cases are near zero. Which, of course, how are they going to accomplish that? Well, she states right in her plan that this is going to be accomplished through a medical cure, which of course is pipe dream, or vaccination. So this is the end game. The mass vaccination is the end game, and of course we can anticipate. I mean, there's already talk in the medical literature, and policy influencers about mandating any vaccine that makes it to market. Benjamin's asking a question about whether the virus, as I take it, exists. Has it actually been isolated and purified and shown to cause the disease? I am familiar with a lot of talk about how this virus we don't even know that this is a virus and that it's real, and I have to reject those views because it's been isolated many times. Scientists are continually isolating and the virus and publishing genetic sequence, the entire genetic sequence of the virus, and there's a database that's accessible, government, the PubMed.gov, or one of the NIH websites, where they publish all the reported genome sequences of the virus. Because of course, as the virus transmits through the population, the global population, it's mutating, and so there's slightly different variations and different strains of the virus, and they're being constantly reported. So when people say that it's not been isolated, I don't know. I honestly don't know what they're trying to say with that. The virus exists. We know it exists. So this is kind of a follow-up on what I was just talking about, the second wave. So Alice is asking, is there any real science behind the warning that we will get a second wave? And I think there is. It makes sense because, again, going back to the Imperial College estimate, because the reason for that was because the lockdown measures, which are, of course, intended to reduce transmission, they prevent herd immunity, natural herd immunity. And of course, the Imperial College, Neil Ferguson and his colleagues at the Imperial College, they acknowledged that, and they stated that right in their paper, that by preventing herd immunity when the lockdown measures are ended, that there will be a second wave. That was the logic for it, and this makes logical sense. And so I think this is something we need to consider in terms of comparing policies across governments. So a lot of eyes have been on Sweden, which of course didn't implement strict lockdown measures. They did. It's false that they didn't implement any measures. It wasn't business as usual, like sometimes we hear. They did implement measures, including some, mandatory measures. But for the most part, they did rely on just voluntary compliance with guidelines and recommendations. And for the most part, their society, people just naturally changed their behavior, which makes sense. I mean, we don't need people to dictate to us how to behave and how to protect ourselves. And so people just naturally change their behavior because they know what's in their best interest. But the difference is that allows for people to make their own individual choices and exercise individual judgment. Because politicians, there's nobody in Lansing or nobody in Washington D.C. who can tell me, based on what my individual circumstances are, what's best for me individually or what's best for my family. They just don't know. Only I'm able to do that risk-benefit analysis. For example, if somebody is working and they're afraid of the virus, they're afraid if they go to their jobs, they're going to come home and bring the virus into their household. Maybe they have someone in the household who has risk factors for severe disease, someone elderly in the family, grandparent or something perhaps. And so there's legitimate reasons to be concerned about that. But the thing is anyone who doesn't want to, who feels like they shouldn't be working, well, they have that choice not to go to work. But to tell everyone else that they can't go to work, even if they think that the risk to them and their family is low, and they feel that the risk of not working and not making an income and not being able to provide for the family and put food on the table and things, losing their homes possibly, not being able to pay the rent, just the risk of financial disaster, if they feel that risk is greater than the risk from the virus, why shouldn't they be able to allow to choose? So that, I think politicians can't make these types of judgments on behalf of all of us because every circumstance is different. Every individual has different circumstances. So this is a really important point. So that's kind of the main difference between what the Swedish approach and the approach of many other governments is that Sweden relied on recommendations. And to get back to the question, so with regards to the second wave, I think what we're going to see, Sweden has been criticized because they have had higher rate of deaths per capita than its neighbors, than its Scandinavian neighbors, but also fewer deaths per capita than like the UK, Belgium, France, Italy, I believe, or Spain and Italy, maybe not France. And so they've been criticized for this. But if you look at the deaths in Sweden, it's been predominantly, half or more has been in the nursing care homes, the long-term care facilities, which lockdown measures do nothing to prevent. And we'll talk more about that maybe. But and so I think what's going to happen is you have to consider the long term. You can't just look, at what's happened to date. I think we need to project into the future and consider what's going to happen. And I think what's going to happen is that Sweden won't see a second wave that's going to be particularly terrible. It's going to be pretty mild, I think, in Sweden. Whereas in all these other countries that implemented lockdowns and they're preventing herd immunity from developing, yeah, if they try to lift these lockdown measures, the case numbers are going to rise again. And I think that's natural. I think that's logical that that's what's going to happen. And so they're either going to have to shut down the economy again or find out a way to deal with it in a more sensible manner. So I do think there is science behind the second wave, to answer the question in brief. All right, let me take a gander at some of these questions. Mariah points out that Bill Gates partially funds the Imperial College. This is true. Just like the NIH and Anthony Fauci's organization within the NIH is funding a lot of these experimental vaccines, including the one from Moderna. Mel's asking, as time goes on, won't there be a genetic shift in the virus so that they can't propose that there will be one curative vaccine? This is a really good question. Scientists aren't really sure. So a good comparison, I think, is the influenza vaccine, because with influenza, the virus evolves so rapidly year to year that it's a new virus essentially every year. So that we've lost, so that you do have protective immunity. There is cross-protective immunity between strains of influenza. But if you're infected with a brand new strain that you haven't been infected with before, the immunity isn't going to be as strong as against a strain you have been infected with before. And so this is why the vaccines have to be, it's a brand new vaccine every single year with the flu shot. So every year they come up with a new formulation for the flu shot based on the strain that they think, that they make an educated guess about, will be mostly in circulation, which a lot of times are wrong. In fact, most of the time they're wrong, and the vaccine just isn't effective. With coronavirus, it doesn't seem to evolve as rapidly as the flu. So it has evolved since the pandemic began. There have been evolutions and genetic shift with the virus. Another point to be made about the evolution is that as it transmits through the human population, the tendency is towards decreasing virulence, so it is to become less and less severe of a disease. That's the tendency of evolution. So there's this question about, well, if it's continually evolving and they develop a vaccine and then it kind of evolves, is the vaccine going to remain effective? And they don't know the answer to that. And even if it doesn't evolve, they don't know whether the vaccines are going to be effective, because the vaccines are all really targeted at antibodies. They're all, the idea is we're going to stimulate an antibody response. But again, studies have shown, as I was kind of alluding to earlier, studies have shown that the antibody response may not be the most important thing in terms of protection from against severe disease with COVID-19. In fact, higher antibody levels are associated with more severe disease, which isn't to say that the higher antibody levels are the cause of the more severe disease, but if you get more severe disease, your body seems to stimulate more antibodies, which indicates to me, my assessment of that is that this indicates that there's a deficiency in cellular immunity. Whereas children, for example, you seem to have immune systems that just they're capable of handling this virus very efficiently. And so people who do, whether they're children or younger adults or just people without comorbidities, people who don't develop severe disease, they tend to develop few, if any, detectable antibodies. But that doesn't mean that they're not immune. It doesn't mean they obviously have recovered from the disease or never developed the disease in the first place, because their immune systems are so strong and so in functioning properly, functioning the way they should. And so the antibodies aren't an indication necessarily of a healthy functioning immune system. It's more an indication of there's something wrong where cellular immunity isn't doing the job, and so the immune system is relying on increasing levels of antibodies to try to fight off the virus. And then, of course, with the more severe disease, you get the cytokine storm, the hyperinflammatory response, and this is what's associated with death, is that you have this dysfunctional immune response, and that's what actually kills you is your own immune system's response to the virus. So it's a really good question about the evolution of the virus and the vaccine and whether it's going to work. All right, I'm going to scroll back up here. I have to skip through some of the questions. I'm going to go back through and see if there's some here that I missed. Okay, so Doug is asking, can you help me understand, is there a difference between coronavirus and COVID-19? Well, the way the media use the word coronavirus, there's actually well, not many, but there's several coronaviruses that we know of, human coronaviruses. There's many in the bat population. Coronaviruses in bat population, I don't even know how many there are, but it's very common. But as far as human coronaviruses, there are 4, I believe, common human coronaviruses, and there's been 3 novel human coronaviruses. So SARS, MERS, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, and then this one, SARS-CoV-2. And so SARS-CoV-2 stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2. And of course, the media just say coronavirus. There's other coronaviruses. The common cold, again, is caused by 20% globally of common colds are caused by human coronaviruses, common coronaviruses. So COVID-19 refers specifically to the disease caused by SARS-CoV-2. So it's coronavirus disease 2019. The 2019 is because that's when the novel coronavirus emerged in the area of Wuhan, China. So those are the names. So SARS-CoV-2 is the name of the virus. COVID-19 is the name of the disease caused by the virus. And of course, the media are constantly confusing those two things, and they say coronavirus or they say COVID-19 when they mean the name of the virus, and so it can be very confusing. Hopefully, that was the question that was being asked, and hopefully that answered it. So the second part of that question is, what are the tests looking for? So I'm assuming this is referring to the PCR assays. So that these assays, what they do is they're designed to detect specific genome sequence of the virus that is unique to this particular virus. And then what they do is they amplify it, so they kind of amplify that genetic sequence. And if they don't detect the virus, there's nothing to amplify. So there's nothing there. It's a negative result. But there does have to be enough of the virus detected for it to be amplified. And so if they did, then that's what a positive result is. It shows that there's enough virus there. And so they actually use the amplification of the virus through these tests as kind of a measure. It's a proxy measure of viral load. So, for example, they take a swab of patients, and then they run it through the test, and then they can kind of measure viral load. And so it's a proxy measure. So based on how many times it has to be kind of replicated in the test to be able to detect a measurable amount of virus. And so that's one way that they kind of measure the viral load. And so that's what the tests are designed to measure. They're looking for genetic sequence of the virus. But there's another part of that question. So is this related to just presence of the virus or an active infection? And so again, I think I mentioned earlier that these PCR assays, if they detect that there's viral RNA present in the body, that doesn't necessarily mean there's an active infection. The infection could have been cleared. It could be just like dead pieces of the virus inactivated, the non-infectious, non-viable RNA from the virus. In fact, you've probably heard about reports of people being reinfected, but that's most likely not what's happened. Most likely, there might be some people who just have some kind of immune dysfunction and they are able to get reinfected, even though they just had the virus. I haven't seen reports of that, but most of the reports, all of the reports that I've seen, can be explained another way, which is that it's not a reinfection. What happened is that they got tested, they had a positive result, they recovered, they were tested again, they had a negative result, and then later on they had a follow-up test and they tested positive again. A couple of things could be happening there. So one would be with the negative result in between, it could have been a false negative. So maybe they'd still had a mild ongoing infection. It was just a false negative test result. Another possibility is that the later positive result could have just detected viral RNA that's not infectious. So that explains these cases of, you hear of cases of reinfection. And of course, this goes along with what I was saying earlier about all the fear mongering about, there's no immunity to coronavirus. People, there won't be long lasting immunity. And so we need the vaccines. And of course, there's kind of a contradiction there. There's kind of this cognitive dissonance. So, well, if our immune system doesn't develop immunity to this virus on its own, how are they supposed to develop a vaccine that's supposed to mimic, our body's natural immune response without causing the disease? How are they supposed to do that? How are they supposed to make an effective vaccine if there's no effective immune response to the virus? And of course, so there's that cognitive dissonance. And as I was talking about earlier, studies have shown that there is immunity to the coronavirus. And another point to make about that is that it seems that the level of exposure, infection in the population for herd immunity to be developed is much, much lower than originally thought. And so we've heard estimates, we need 60% of the population, 70%, 80% of the population to get infected before we can have herd immunity, and that's just unacceptable. That would mean an unacceptable levels of number of deaths. But more recent research has hypothesized that actually the percentage required of population infection to obtain herd immunity could be much, much lower than that, and partly due to this cross-protective immunity that already exists to an extent in the population. So there's that. Let me scroll here through the questions again. Kathy mentions T cells. Yes. There's a question about whether the events that are happening, including the violence, is just kind of organic or whether it was pre-planned. I know probably everyone here has heard of the whole pandemic film, and there's that term has been used a lot elsewhere as well at the pandemic, and I think there's quite a widespread view that certain elements of what's happened at least have been pre-planned, and I think what's fed into that belief, there's a lot of things that the media don't want to talk about, they try to censor, and they don't want us talking about. So, for example, the role of the Gates Foundation. There was the event, what was it, Event 201, if memory serves, that was held prior to the pandemic, very shortly beforehand, in which they simulated a pandemic happening, where a novel virus emerged, and what would the response be to it, and it was very fortuitous, very coincidentally fortuitous. And then, of course, there's questions about the virus's origins, and did it originate from the lab in Wuhan? Was it a result of gain-of-function research? There's all these questions about this, which perhaps we can delve into with a separate question. But my view is not that there was kind of this pre-planned event. I don't think these things are. I don't think there's kind of a conspiracy of that sort happening. As far as whether the virus was man-made or not, we don't know. If it was created in the lab, it was done using means that that don't leave a signature, they don't leave a trace in terms of being able to study the genetic code of the virus and say, oh well, they took this and they inserted it here. If they did do that, they did it using means that really mimic natural evolution. So accelerated evolution, if you will, lab accelerated evolution, which is possible. They do have that technology. They have the means to be able to genetically manipulate viruses and create viruses in the lab using methods that really don't leave a trace, so you can't really tell the difference. And so this is one hypothesis. So the other leading hypothesis is that it was that it evolved naturally, that there was a coronavirus in the bat population, that somehow maybe there was an intermediary species, civets or something, that became infected, and then it was transferred to the human population, and so there's this kind of evolutionary process. Frankly, the hypothesis that, in my view, is the one that best fits the evidence, at least the circumstantial evidence that is available, is that it originated from the lab. I can't prove that. It's just, it's very strange that, number one, that the lab happens to be there. And in fact, there's the, I forget her name, but there's a very famous, world famous researcher from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, who immediately, as soon as she learned about this pandemic, and she's on the record saying this, she gave an interview and she talked about this, and her first thought was, did it come from our lab? So it was just a natural instinct for her to think that that this might have escaped from their lab. And of course, she denies that, and the institute denies it. But we don't really know what they were researching there, and we know that our own government was funding research through an intermediary. Our NIH, Anthony Fauci's organization, has funded research called gain-of-function research. So this is research specifically designed to try to create more deadly viruses, more infectious viruses, and of course the logical rationale for this, that they, the reason that they say they need to do this research is so that they can try to anticipate, viruses that might emerge from nature and cause a pandemic. But of course, they're risking creating the very thing that they say they want to prevent with this type of research. And so I think this is a very, very important issue that needs to be addressed. And the way the media talk about it is, anyone who doesn't believe that it evolved naturally is a conspiracy theorist. And I'm not one. Like I said, I don't believe that there was some kind of pre-planned conspiracy of any kind, but I do believe that is the leading hypothesis, that it did escape from that lab. Not intentionally. I don't believe it was intentional, but I think that best fits the evidence and what we know with the virus. So anyhow, that's a slight tangent on the question, but hopefully that at least gives my view of that. Kathy points out that they're stressing the alleged waning of antibodies so that they can sell the vaccine to be given every few months, and this is this is a really good point. Notice the cognitive dissonance of the media, where every time they talk about natural immunity to this virus, it's always this alarm and fear mongering that, oh, look, the antibodies wane and so people won't have immunity. But every time they report about the vaccines under development, and oh, they just released results of the first phase of their trial, and oh, they showed that the vaccine produced antibodies. So yay, good news, immunity. Well, they can't have it both ways, you know. Even if the vaccine does produce antibodies, does stimulate production, like a high antibody titer, they don't know yet that that's a correlate of immunity. So they don't know that a certain level of antibodies equals immunity. And we know from other viruses and other infections that antibodies are neither always sufficient nor even necessary for immunity. And so there's a lot of positive things happening, I think, in terms of the population being educated. And so this is one of them. You know, number one, the idea, the concept of natural herd immunity is being talked about openly in the media. That's great. Because before, you know, if you talked about natural herd immunity, you were like, are you crazy or something? And now it's basic epidemiology that there's this thing called natural herd immunity. Another one is the awakening about, you know, the fact that antibodies don't equal immunity. And this is really important because, of course, the FDA uses antibody titer as a surrogate measure of immunity for the purposes of vaccine licensure. And so this kind of awakening that, well, antibodies, just because you have antibodies doesn't mean you're immune, I think is a really healthy, beneficial thing. But of course, as Kathy suggests, they're using it for fear mongering. You know, well, your antibodies go away. When it comes to natural immunity, your antibodies, you know, wane rapidly. That means you don't have immunity. But I was reading a pair of articles on CNN that really were a perfect example of what I'm talking about, where the one article was citing, guess who, somebody from the Imperial College who's a vaccine researcher at the Imperial College, saying, oh, the immunity is wane rapidly, which means you won't have immunity, and so our only hope lies in the vaccine. That was the message of the article. Another article a couple days later about a vaccine trial showing how it stimulated antibodies for at least a period of 2 months at least. They didn't go beyond that, so they don't know how long they're going to last. And it was, of course, all good news and hope, and this wonderful news about, you know, this hopefully successful vaccine. And they pointed out in that article, they pointed out, this is the thing that really got me, was that they said that, well, even if the antibodies do wane rapidly, and so there's not long-lasting antibodies, well, the vaccine also seemed to stimulate T-cell immunity. And so there could be long-term immunity from that. It's like, well, how come the other CNN article didn't talk about that? How come they're saying antibodies equal immunity? If you don't have antibodies, you don't have immunity. How come they didn't talk about how all the studies showing that we have this T-cell response as well, and that we have not only potential very long-term, which we know from SARS, SARS-1, that there was this T-cell that was very dependent on the T-cell response, that there's long-term immunity from the T-cell response. And so how come the media isn't reporting it? So there's this clear double standard in the media's reporting about immunity. So I agree with Kathy's observation about that. Steven's asking about Rockefeller Foundation lockstep scenario narrative. I think I know what Steven's asking about. There was a document that I read from the Rockefeller Foundation where, as I recall, this was some time ago now, but they were talking about how the need for contact tracing and, you know, really invasive. Of course, they kind of couched their recommendations and things in terms of, well, we need to protect people's privacy, but at the same time, they were advocating things that, you know, would necessarily mean loss of privacy. I don't recall much more about what that document was. I may have just scanned through it. I may not have read it super carefully. So I can't really answer that question beyond that, but hopefully that is the same document that Steven's asking about. So let me kind of cruise here. Kathy's asking, did I watch the debate between Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Alan Dershowitz? And that happened, was it just yesterday, I think? Yesterday morning? And no, I haven't seen that yet. I do have it bookmarked, and I do hope to be able to make time to watch that. They debated, by the way, the constitutionality of vaccine mandates. Alan Dershowitz, for anyone who isn't familiar, is it Harvard? I believe he's a Harvard law professor. And of course, I assume everyone here knows Robert F. Kennedy Jr. By the way, he's so, as you all I'm sure know, he's the founder of Children's Health Defense, where I am a contributing writer. So, all right, let me cruise through these. Just I'm reading comments. I don't have somebody like reading comments and kind of like sending, like picking out comments and giving them to me. I'm all alone here, so bear with me as I kind of switch between answering questions and then reading comments. I'm not able to like monitor the questions that come through as I'm speaking, so I'm just going to take a moment and just scroll through, and I won't be able to answer every single one, but I want to at least try to pick out some of the ones that are more common, or maybe ones that I feel are the most important. All right. Okay. Well, I'm going to scroll back up. Just give me a moment. So Nikki is asking about the numbers in Florida and Arizona, and why are the numbers going back up? I think there's a number of reasons for that. One, I know the governors in those states, I think, have claimed that the reason for that is the increase in testing. I think that partially explains it. I also think there really is a real rise in case numbers, which seems logical to me, because I think that the lockdown measures, probably are effective in terms of reducing transmission. But I don't necessarily think that that's a good thing. The media they always talk about these case numbers as though like ensuring a low number of cases is like the goal, and that's the end game here, is that we just have to prevent this virus from spreading, and we need to keep case numbers down, which was never the original justification for these measures. Again, the original justification was we need to keep hospitals from being overwhelmed. Well, that's in most cases that's been the case. We're not all New York, and we're not all northern Italy, and so I think that there has been a true increase in cases. Although I have seen arguments as well that a lot of what they've done is they've taken cases that were from the past, like past testing, and they just were never reported, and they have these backloads of tests, and sometimes you see this. I mean, it's very obvious. Sometimes there's just like a day where there's like this huge peak, and well, nature doesn't jump is kind of a term in epidemiology, where you see these kind of like these statistical artifacts of the way that they're reporting cases, or the way that they're doing testing. And so if you kind of use if you try to graph something in Excel, you can use like a 7-day average curve or something like that, and it kind of smooths out the graph, so you kind of eliminate all these kind of spikes and peaks and things that are kind of unnatural, and those are all statistical artifacts. But in terms of the general trend and the upward trend, I don't think it's a statistical artifact. I think there really probably is an upward increase in cases. But the thing is, I don't view that as a bad thing at all. I think this is a good thing, because if you look at the cases, guess what? It's in younger people. It's younger populations, and we know the data are very, very clear about this, that there are it is a severe disease. COVID-19 can be a very severe disease for certain individuals. However, for the vast majority of the population, SARS-CoV-2 does not represent a serious risk to our health. So if you're elderly and you have comorbidities, there's certain underlying diseases that have been found to be risk factors for severe disease. Cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, liver disease, kidney disease. So there are certain comorbidities that are associated with severe disease, along with old age, but not old age necessarily by itself. It tends to be old age in combination with underlying disease. So these individuals are at risk. The rest of us are really not. If you're under 65 years old and you're healthy, you have no underlying medical conditions, the risk is really pretty negligible. And this is especially true for children. The risk to children is really negligible. I mean, the number of children just don't develop severe disease. Most children don't. The numbers are very, very small, and the number of deaths are very, very small. Deaths are almost unknown in children. And so the idea that here's one of the key points that I really want to drive home. We're coming up on 9 o'clock here, but I really want to drive this point home is that, in my view, what sensible measures would be to protect those at greatest risk, to isolate those individuals and to protect them, and to make sure that transmission events aren't occurring with them, while allowing everyone else to get on with their lives, to go about making a living, to have a functioning economy, and in developing herd immunity that would in turn allow eventually those elderly people at risk to come out of isolation and enjoy the quality, the quality of their lives, and enjoy a quality standard of living for the remainder of their years, because they'd be protected through herd immunity, because the population, all the people who are at low risk, were out there, in building that population herd immunity. So that's what sensible policies would have looked like. Instead, we've had these lockdown measures, which have done nothing to protect those at greatest risk. So, for example, at minimally 40% of deaths in the United States were in nursing care homes. Lockdown measures did nothing to protect elderly people in long-term care facilities. And so effectively with lockdown measures, we've had the exact opposite. We prevented people who are at low risk from going out and building herd immunity, while failing to protect those at highest risk. So this is mass insanity, in my view, and it's not sensible measures, and we really need to be fighting these extreme policies that, again, as I opened with, have consequences have costs in terms of health and lives, and also you really violate fundamental human rights. You're really violating our liberties, and so I think we need to fight these politics. And this is again the point of this question and answer session. Is I just want to be able to kind of empower you with knowledge and with answers that you might need. For example, if you're in conversations with people and you meet those people who are like pro lockdown and maybe pro vaccine mandates and this kind of thing. I want to make sure that you have what you need to be able to challenge them, and to effectively debate them and challenge their views. And also, for people who who are on the edge, maybe they're not certain, they're not really set in one position or the other. You can influence them. You can bring up these topics. You can have these conversations with other people. We really just need to make a kind of a collective effort to, number one, educate ourselves, and then to share that knowledge with others, whether it's on social media, emailing people, conversations with friends and family in person, whatever we can do to try to just change the discussion in this country and just kind of change the nature of the public discourse. We need to be all doing our part in that. And so hopefully you found this question and answer session helpful toward that end. So it is 9 o'clock. I did say I was going to try to cut it off at about an hour, but I'm happy to continue going a little bit longer here. There are some remaining questions, so I'll try to at least just kind of cruise through a few more questions here. Let me see. There's the question of masks, and nobody has a couple questions kind of related to masks, and I should probably say a couple things about masks. And I kind of expected this question to come up more, and I'm surprised it didn't. But with the masks, just the whole debate has really been polarized. So you have the people who are like, obey governor's orders, you must wear a mask when you're out in public, and then you have people who are like, well, masks aren't effective and they can actually be harmful, and you shouldn't wear a mask. And my view is that neither of these positions is really reasonable. And the problem to me is that there are circumstances in which wearing a mask makes sense. If we do want to reduce transmission, maybe we don't want to reduce transmission. If again, one of the problems is that if you're out, for example, there's this fear that if you're going to go to the grocery store and you're going to pass somebody in the aisle and you're going to get infected from them if they're not wearing a mask. But this is really not what the science is telling us. The science is telling us is that for transmission to occur, it requires prolonged close contact. And so again, I mentioned airborne transmission earlier. This kind of relates to the symptomatic transmission question, or asymptomatic transmission. So there's this belief that the virus is airborne, so that it's people cough, they sneeze, even talking, even breathing. They're putting the virus into the air, and then it's in the air, and it's going to travel. It can stay in the air for a long time. It can travel some distance, and so there's some confusion about what airborne actually means. Airborne transmission. You think, oh, you cough and it goes through the air and you infect somebody, so that's airborne transmission, but that's not the case. It's a technical term, and so typically, so the main mode of transmission with this virus is, there's no debate about this. It's uncontroversial. Is that it's larger respiratory droplets. So when you cough and sneeze, for example, you produce these droplets. But then there's also smaller aerosolized particles. So the smaller droplets are known as aerosols, and this is what's referred to as airborne transmission. And so the media wants you to believe that airborne transmission has been scientifically proven. That is false. And in fact, I've written one article already about that, CNN lying about it. I'm working right now on my next article series that I'm going to be publishing. I think it's going to be a series because it would be a long to do as a single article. It's going to be on how the New York Times blatantly lies about this, claiming that scientists have proven that the virus is airborne, and they have not. And I can show that from looking at the New York Times' own sources, just as I did with CNN, looking at their own sources. And so the science is very unclear about whether it's airborne or not. And so, for example, they have detected viral RNA again. This goes back to the question about the testing and what the PCR assays are actually detecting. So they have detected viral RNA in air samples, for example. But as the WHO points out, just because viral RNA is present doesn't mean that it's infectious virus. It doesn't mean that it's like viable virus capable of infecting somebody. This is a really important question. They have not established, to this day, they have not yet established that aerosols, aerosolized particles, the smaller droplets, contain infectious virus. It might contain viral RNA, but it hasn't been proven yet that it can actually is capable of causing infection. So that's one point. There are also events that they call the super spreader events, where there's one famous example is a choir in Washington State, where members of a choir were singing together, and then numerous of them developed COVID-19. Two of them, I believe, died. And so that was, they call this a super spreader event, where many people kind of are infected in one event. And so there are certain super spreader events that have been documented where airborne transmission has been hypothesized but not proven. And so the thing is that yes, aerosol transmission could explain those events to some extent, but it's not clear that respiratory droplet transmission couldn't also explain it without requiring airborne transmission. So the science is really very unclear, and it is very much not settled. There's a great deal of controversy and debate about whether airborne transmission is occurring. And so the media want to make it a question of to what extent does airborne transmission contribute to community spread. That's not the question. The question is, does it even happen at all? And that's the truth about where the science is at. Don't let the media lie to you and fool you. So just kind of wrap it up here. To share, if you're with me and you're not already familiar with my work, I do have quite a number of articles on this issue. I'm going to go ahead and post in the comments right now a page, jeremyrhammond.com/coronavirus, where I've kind of compiled all the work I've done on this topic. So there's articles there you can browse through, a couple of videos as well. If you're with me and you're not already on my newsletter, I assume most of you probably already are subscribers, but if you're not, head to jeremyrhammond.com/FDA, and there you can sign up for my newsletter and also download a free report, 5 horrifying facts about the FDA vaccine approval process. A lot of good information in there. And last but not least, if you appreciate the work that I do and value it, I do rely on reader support to be able to do the research that I do and to produce the kind of writings that I do. So if you are not already a contributor and you'd like to contribute, you can head to jeremyrhammond.com/crowdfunding, and that's my donation page. So that said, I might go ahead and answer a couple more questions here. I imagine some people can't stay that long, but for those of you who can stick around a little bit longer, I'll go ahead and answer a few more questions. Kathy's saying that the Oxford vaccine, so Oxford University is one of the one of the groups that is developing a vaccine. There's quite a lot of them. Imperial College, Moderna. There's a number of different companies. Actually, there's a lot of different companies working on the vaccines. She's pointing out that the Oxford vaccine trial said antibodies last just over 4 weeks. I wasn't aware of that, so I can't confirm that, but that's interesting if that's the case. Although I have heard, what I've been reading in the media is that the Oxford vaccine is actually one of the more promising vaccines, but of course there's at such an early stage in trials right now. They have no ability to determine safety or effectiveness at this point. Not yet. Kathy points out that there's a forced antibody responses from vaccines are what's causing our explosion of autoimmune diseases. Hypothesizing this, I concur with that opinion. I think that the vaccine schedule, the CDC's vaccine schedule, is contributing to chronic, epidemic rates of chronic illnesses among children, including asthma, allergies, autoimmune diseases, neurodevelopmental diseases and disorders. I think, and we're told, of course, that the vaccine schedule has been proven safe. And the reason this relates to the coronavirus is that, we have people are dying from dysfunctional immune responses, essentially. And so I think there could be a role in terms of vaccination and mass vaccination in that. Interestingly, I should point out that the flu vaccine, there are 2 studies I know of that have associated influenza vaccine with increased risk of infection with common human coronaviruses. And so, of course, the coronaviruses that cause a common cold are genetically related to SARS-CoV-2, and so it's reasonable to hypothesize that this might also be the case for COVID-19, that getting an annual flu shot could potentially increase your risk of COVID-19, the severe COVID-19 disease. And so I think that's a question that it would be an obvious one for scientists to investigate and research. But interestingly, I shouldn't say, unsurprisingly, I should say, I haven't seen any research into that. So be careful though, because I have seen claims that the flu shot increases the risk of COVID-19. That's not what those studies showed. They were with respect to common human coronaviruses. So there's a bit of a logical leap there. So we have to be careful about what we say. But that is true that I know of at least 2 studies, including one was a randomized controlled trial showing that getting a flu shot was associated with an increased risk of coronavirus infection in children. The other one was a U.S. Army study showing that vaccination with the flu shot increased the risk of coronavirus infection. And so, yeah, I think that's a reasonable hypothesis that mass vaccination could be affecting our immune system in ways that put us at greater risk of infection from COVID-19. Another great example of that would be the DTP vaccine. This is another good example of so the diphtheria, tetanus, and whole cell pertussis vaccine, which is no longer used in the U.S. and developed countries, but still the most widely used vaccine, to my understanding. According to a number of papers I've read, around the world, it's still used widely in WHO campaigns in developing countries, and it's been associated with an increased rate of childhood mortality. So even though it seems to protect, against the 3 target diseases, it seems to affect children's immune systems in ways that makes their immune system weaker, more vulnerable to other infections and other diseases, and so children die at a higher rate. And so the detrimental effects on the immune system of the vaccine outweigh any beneficial effects of the vaccine on the immune system. And this is true for non-live vaccines in general. And there's Peter Abbey, and I believe her name is, I'm thinking Stephanie Ben. I may have her first name wrong, but Dr. Ben and Dr. Abbey, 2 Danish researchers who have been leading research in this field for many years now, into what is called non-specific effects. So non-specific effects of vaccines, meaning these unintended consequences other than the specific effects. So the specific effect of any vaccine is to protect against the target disease. That's the specific effect. And so there's non-specific effects of vaccines. And so for increased childhood mortality, they call it is a non-specific effect of vaccines. And so I think this is a really good point and a good question, a good hypothesis. What is the impact of the CDC's vaccine schedule and other governments, vaccine schedules which aren't quite so aggressive as here in the U.S. Since we have the most aggressive vaccine schedule, I believe, including hepatitis B vaccine given at birth. I think that's a really good question, a good point, and a legitimate question to ask is what is the detrimental, what are the non-specific effects, because they've never been studied. The CDC schedule has never been studied, in terms of the schedule as a whole. So that's a really good point. All right, I'm just kind of cruise through the last Rothbard incarnate. Thanks, George. I'm a big fan of Murray Rothbard. He's a great economist, by the way. Oh, and I should mention a couple of my books I've done. So you can see here behind me, Obstacle to Peace is kind of my major book on the Israel-Palestine conflict. A lot of my research is also focused on the economy. Another book I have is Ron Paul versus Paul Krugman, Austrian versus Keynesian economics in the financial crisis. And I talk about how the Federal Reserve essentially caused the housing bubble that precipitated the financial crisis. So I focused a lot on the role of the Fed, and so Murray Rothbard is one of the greats that I've studied. So I appreciate that comment. Holly says, loved your post on masks, posted a little bit ago. Thank you. You'll find that again on jeremyrhammond.com/coronavirus. I've done a couple on masks. I've done a couple on transmission. So you can read my articles there. All right. So with that, let's see. There might be a couple. I should create a book, Holly says. I do intend to. Actually, I've worked on, before I was doing the coronavirus research, I was planning on doing a fifth installment. Is it fifth? Yeah, fifth installment of my major flu shot series. So if you're not familiar, I've done a major influenza vaccine expose. It's 4 parts so far that have been published. And there was a 5th part that I intended to write. It's actually quite a lot written already. When the pandemic hit, it just all my attention, everything I was doing, I kind of had to drop and shift my focus to this, because it is such a serious issue, and the threat, I think, coming from governments is so severe that I'm compelled to focus all my time and attention on this. But I will get back to that flu shot series and put out the 5th installment of that. And then I do intend at some point also to kind of compile that. I'll probably update it and maybe expand it and compile those 5 parts into a book. So I do have that book at some point in the future on the way. And I do intend. I don't have anything specific in terms of books coming yet, but I do intend to publish books about this and other topics. It's just writing books takes a lot of time, and it's hard when nobody's paying me to do it. So. Will this video be archived? I am going to, hopefully, I've never done a Facebook Live before, so hopefully as soon as I hit in live video, I think it's going to give me the option to save it and publish it to my page. So I do intend to save it and keep that recording, and I'll share that. If you're on my newsletter, I'll be sure to share the link so that anyone who wasn't here with me today can at least watch it and get this information. So yes, I do intend to archive the video, and hopefully I'll be able to download a copy and be able to save a copy and archive it on my own website as well as on Facebook. Okay. Kathy points out that they've tried to make vaccines against coronaviruses in the past, and they've always failed. That there's a dangerous enhanced immune response, and that's right on. In fact, I think that's the term for it. Is they call it immune enhancement, is the term in the literature for it. Essentially, what it was is that they tried to develop a vaccine against the first SARS-1. That came around in 2002, 2003, I think, and they failed. And one of the problems that they encountered was that in test animals that they had administered the vaccine to developed more severe disease upon exposure, and so they called this immune enhancement. And so and it was the antibody response, as far as I understand it, that actually made the animals more vulnerable to infection. So again, just because you have an high antibody titer, and again, the vaccine companies that are developing experimental vaccines right now, this is, that's their holy grail. That's the thing that's what they're aiming for, is if they can, develop a vaccine that's going to create neutralizing antibodies against the spike protein of the virus. So, you've seen pictures of the virus, and it's got these little spikes, those little crown-shaped spikes, and that's why it's called a coronavirus, because corona crown. Um, and so that's called the spike protein, and so they're trying to create antibodies that will, uh, latch on to that spike protein and neutralize the virus. But again, we don't know what the correlates of immunity are yet, even. So they're trying to develop these vaccines. They don't even understand the immune response to this virus yet. They don't understand. They don't know what correlates of immunity are yet, and yet they're still trying to develop these vaccines to produce this immune response. And again, just because you have antibodies doesn't mean you're immune. Just because you don't have antibodies doesn't mean you're not immune. So there's just kind of this huge void in the scientific knowledge. All these unknowns, and the idea that they're going to be able to develop a safe and effective vaccine before they answer all these necessary questions is really kind of insane. I think it's a pipe dream. It's not going to happen. Vitamin D. Holly makes a point about vitamin D. I think this is really important. This is, how come the media never talk to us about, they always talk about how there's such a severe disease that this virus causes and is so deadly, and we need drugs or vaccines to cure us or to prevent the disease. And they don't talk about vitamin D. They don't talk about maintaining a healthy immune system and supporting immune function, with your diet and with exercise and with nutrients and things like this. And vitamin D is known to be associated with influenza. Vitamin D deficiency is a risk factor for influenza. It's super important for all kinds of immune functions. And and the fact that, Holly also makes the point that people in lockdown, they're not getting out and getting vitamin D. In fact, I just read 2 studies about that. Actually, I didn't read the studies yet, but I saved 2 studies and I read the abstracts, talking about how the lockdowns have had a detrimental effect on not only vitamin D levels, but sunshine also helps with nitric oxide creation. And so, a lot of the issues with COVID-19 severe has been like blood issues, like blood clotting and things. And so nitric oxide is also really important to prevent severe disease. And so lack of sunshine is having this detrimental effect on people's ability to produce nitric oxide, vitamin D, and this in turn could be putting them at greater risk of severe COVID-19, ironically. So there's that. Okay. That's about all the questions here. Let me see. Vaccine. Mel's asking regarding nomenclature of virus versus infection. So is a vaccine developed to counter COVID-19 or coronavirus SARS-2? That's a good question. Typically, they call them, as far as I've seen them in the media, they call them COVID-19 vaccines. But of course, the media also refer to the name of the virus as COVID-19, which is incorrect. COVID-19, again, as I mentioned earlier, is the name of the disease, whereas the name of the virus is SARS-CoV-2. So the idea of the vaccines would be to stimulate an antibody response against, to the vaccine with antibodies that latch on to the spike protein and neutralize the virus. And so, the vaccine is really to counter the virus, the coronavirus, and to prevent cells from being infected in the first place. So T cell immunity is, cellular immunity is an immune response where you have these immune responses that basically kill the virus in the infected cells. And if you have an infected cell, you have this other immune response that will just destroy the infected cell. And so you have both antibody and cellular immune responses, in addition to innate immunity, and there's other types of immunity. And so of course the vaccines, are always focused on the antibodies. But hopefully that answers the question. There's always all this confusion about the nomenclature and the names, and I try to be precise and say, when I'm referring to the name of the virus, I say SARS-CoV-2, and if I'm talking about the disease, I say COVID-19. Janet's asking about a certain, I'm assuming it's a drug, budesonide. to successfully treat COVID-19. I'm not sure. That might be the. I watched the beginning of a video, a doctor out of Texas talking about a treatment, a steroid treatment that he was giving patients and claiming success. Um, I'm not sure. I'm not familiar, so I can't answer that question. I don't really know. Same with most of these drugs that have been being used. I haven't followed them too closely. It's just not my focus. And so far, to my knowledge, there's not something that's been really proven, at least with really strong studies, to be effective. Just a follow-up question about that, about IV vitamin C, zinc, and hydroxychloroquine. Yeah, hydroxychloroquine, of course, causes so much controversy, including fake studies that have been withdrawn from major journals claiming that there were these risks associated with it. You can go back into medical literature, back to the days of SARS, the first novel coronavirus that came around, and the hydroxychloroquine, was used as an effective treatment, and there's a study about that. So is it proven effective with the SARS-CoV-2? I don't know that it's been proven with good, strong studies. I know there have been studies that have been done, clinical trials and things. A lot of criticisms I've seen is that the sample sizes were too small, or there's different methodological flaws. But of course, there are flaws with any study, and so we really need very large, randomized, placebo-controlled trials to really be able to determine safety and effectiveness of any treatment. And there may be, but I'm just not aware that there's really been any really large studies like that done with hydroxychloroquine. Although there's plenty of reports of it being effective. Same with vitamin C IV treatment. I know in China they used vitamin C treatment as a treatment in patients. Yeah, and I know there's doctors who are doing it in their private practices in the U.S. I've heard of that being the case. And claiming that it's been effective. But then there was, USA Today, just last week I was reading an article, and they're talking about how this is just like some, that there's nothing behind this treatment, and there's no evidence that vitamin C is effective. And to an extent that's true, again, but it's just because they haven't really studied vitamin C. I mean, and this is another really important point. They're spending all these billions and billions of dollars on vaccine research. Taxpayer money too, on vaccine research. Where are all the funds, into the effectiveness of vitamin C, and what dose of vitamin C should people be taking to support their immune system? What dose of vitamin D? Where are all the studies into all these things? And they just haven't done the research. So where are the randomized placebo-controlled trials? Like with vitamin C in colds, or vitamin C in the flu, vitamin C in COVID-19. Why aren't they doing studies into determine the vitamin C status of patients with severe COVID-19 as compared to they could just do cohort studies to compare vitamin C status, vitamin D status, zinc status. Why aren't researchers doing this? Why is the focus, like, they're just so narrowly focused with these blinders on vaccines and other pharmaceutical drugs? And I think it's really there's kind of this opportunity cost in terms of research, that they could be finding much more cheap and effective solutions and treatments and preventative measures, if they just focus their research on other areas. But of course, you can't patent nutrients like vitamin C and vitamin D, and so that's kind of a problem. And so yeah, I think these are really good questions in terms of what is effective. And my view, there's the science behind, in terms of just the science and the knowledge that they have of like how vitamin C and vitamin D and zinc and selenium and so many other nutrients are so essential for our immune systems to function properly. I mean, the mechanistic studies have been done. I mean, they understand the biological mechanisms by which these nutrients enable our immune systems to function. And so there's all these plausible reasons why like high dose vitamin C IV treatment, or even just supplemented vitamin C or vitamin D supplementation. There's all these very clear, plausible, biologically plausible mechanisms by which these types of things, just by maintaining sufficiency of these nutrients, that you can reduce your risk. It has great biological plausibility, but again, they just, the media like to say, well, there hasn't been any randomized controlled studies proving it, and so they just dismiss it. But then that begs the question, why haven't those studies been done? Why are they all focused on vaccines? So, all right, we're coming up on 9:30 here, so I'm gonna leave it at that. Thank you very much for joining me and asking me your questions and participating in this. If you enjoyed this conversation and you got a lot out of it, go ahead and please hit the like button for me. And I will be sharing, make sure you have my newsletter at jeremyrhammond.com/FDA, and I will be sharing the recording of this later if you want to review it or share it with your friends. I'll be sending you that link. Fingers crossed. Hopefully I'll be able to figure out how to do this. Like I said, I've never done this before, so hopefully this will save and I'll have a copy of it and be able to send you that link. And so again, thanks for being with me, and I'm gonna call it a night.